A Great Argead Saga Alexine, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesius, The War Dance. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 41, Cost of Equilibrium. Faced with the crushing weight of the Theban military ultimatum, the royal audience hall of Pella sank into a cold, catatonic void. The faint hiss of sputtering pine torches and the shallow, ragged breathing of terrified court officials were the only sounds remaining in the vast stone chamber. King Perdiccas III felt the margins of his jaw lock with bruising force, a sharp ache radiating up to his temples. To surrender his youngest brother, 14-year-old Philip, the spare anchor of the Argead line, into the callous palms of a southern hegemon, was a bitter, agonizing mutilation of his sovereign identity. Beneath the heavy, suffocating wool of his royal robes, his chest heaved in desperate calculation. "He is only a boy," Perdiccas' inner voice cried out, a desperate, eternal panic clawing at his throat. 14 winters. He belongs in the hills, learning the hunt, not turned into a political bargaining chip for a foreign empire. Yet, his intellect understood his mother's long-term geostrategic blueprint. He knew that sending the young brother to the south bought Macedonia the critical temporal orbit it needed to heal its bleeding borders. But the raw, public humiliation of being overawed, like an impotent teenage before the mocking, sideways glance of Ptolemy, threatened to incinerate his royal composure. Perdiccas drove his fingernails into the ebony armrests of the ancient throne until the wood bit deep into his skin and his knuckles turned a bloodless white, mutely absorbing the crushing weight of a crown that felt more like an executioner's block. Beside the throne, Queen Mother Eurydice stood frozen in an absolute white-hot stillness. She did not lean against her son's high seat. Her spine was as rigid as a bronze pilaster. Underneath her dark mourning veil, her eyes burned with a lethal, calculated focus, locked directly onto the massive, mud-flecked figure of Pelopidas. There was no trace of maternal panic in her posture, nor any fraction of weeping weakness. Having already negotiated the terms of this dark bargain in midnight secrecy, her intellect had long since mastered the visceral pain of the sacrifice. "Cry for him later," she commanded herself, her heart hardening into solid iron. "Ptolemy wants you to break. The barons want to see you weep. Give them nothing but steel. Thebes will keep Philip alive, far from Ptolemy's poison. They will build him into a god, and when he returns, this palace will burn." To her, this room was no longer an audience chamber. It was an execution dock where she was systematically dismantling the ambitions of her rivals. "Macedonia's crown sits precariously. King Perdiccas," Pelopidas spoke, his voice cutting through the heavy air with the blunt, echoing weight of a bronze shield. He did not look at the young monarch, keeping his gaze fixed on the military map unrolled across the central oak table. A throne propped up by assassins, shifting alliances, and border thieves is not a state. It is an open invitation to slaughter. Thebes does not negotiate with chaos. Perdiccas swallowed the bitter bile rising in his throat, forcing his voice to drop into a steady, resonant register, despite the trembling of his hands. The House of Argead has survived centuries of mountain bloodlines and foreign incursions. General, we are not unacquainted with the price of survival. Survival is not sovereignty, Pelopidas countered coldly, finally lifting his eyes from the parchment to sweep the room, his gaze lingering on the nervous guards. And as a final, non-negotiable condition to anchor this treaty, Thebes demands an immediate military contribution. Your administration will deploy an elite detachment of your native companion cavalry to operate as a tactical auxiliary force, safeguarding the rear flank of the Boeotian League. The silence that saturated the hall grew as heavy and suffocating as the deep ocean floor. Ptolemy had fantasized about executing an equitable, symmetrical alliance that would legitimize his position as regent. Instead, Pelopidas had just delivered a demand for absolute vassalage. Old Italus felt the weight of the demand in his marrow. "They don't just want our gold or our grain," he thought, his hand tightening around the head of his staff until his knuckles turned as white as the marble. "They want our blood to shield their own. If we give them our companions, we give them the only blade left to defend our own throat." Parmenion, standing in the shadows of the doorway, felt the familiar, cold detachment of a man surveying a battlefield already lost. "The Theban is not asking," he analyzed, his eyes tracing the line of Pelopidas's jaw. "He's counting the teeth we have left to bite him with. By stripping us of the companions, he ensures we cannot strike back, even if the Illyrians fail to finish us. It is a brilliant surgical amputation of our power. Young Attalus, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, felt a hot, reckless surge of indignation. They treat us like a conquered province, he seethed internally, his fingers itching for the hilt of his sword. The regent sits there paralyzed, while this Theban maps out our ruin. If no one else in this room has the courage to draw steel, then by the gods, perhaps I should be the one to remind them that Macedon does not kneel. As the tension peaked, the heavy doors of the chamber groaned open, and a scout, smelling of smoke and ash, stumbled inside, his face pale with the news from the northern frontier. The tactical auxiliary Thebes requested would soon be the only thing standing between the capital and the fire currently consuming the border. Ptolemy shifted his weight, his bronze armor clinking loudly in the quiet room. His eyes darted toward the Queen Mother. Frantically searching for a fracture in her armor, a single sign of maternal resistance, he could exploit on to break the treaty and save his own military leverage. General Pelopidas, Ptolemy began, his voice tight, attempting to claw back a fraction of authority. To strip this palace of its elite riders, while the Illyrian tribes bare their fangs at our western gates, you do not ask for a contribution. You ask us to bleed ourselves entirely white before our own vassals. How am I to defend Pella without our finest horses? You are already bleeding, Regent. Eurydice's voice cut through Ptolemy's protest, smooth, flat, and completely devoid of warmth. She did not look at him, her eyes remaining ruthlessly anchored to the Theban commander. The Illyrians are a storm that passes, they plunder and retreat. Thebes is an architecture that endures. We pay the price the general names, and we pay it without administrative hesitation. Ptolemy turned on her, his face flushing a dangerous, dark crimson. He is taking the prince, and he is taking the elite horsemen. Eurydice, listen to what he is actually saying. He calls this securing our border, but he is stripping us of our only strength. If he takes the companions away to fight his battles in the south, we are left defenseless against the tribes. Do you truly believe a Theban promise is a wall against a mountain raid? I intend to defend this throne with absolute reality, Ptolemy, she hissed back, her eyes flashing with a predatory venom that silenced him instantly. Something you have failed to compute since you stepped into this court. From the flank of the dais, General Parmenion stepped forward, his veteran hand dropping heavily onto the map table. The wood groaned under his palm. He looked not at the squabbling politicians, but straight into Pelopidas's eyes, speaking with the grim dignity of the kingdom's true tactical vanguard. The companion cavalry is the literal heart of Macedonia's defensive framework, General Parmenion stated, his baritone steady but laced with a profound internal bitterness. We are lending our finest blades to secure the borders of our masters, Parmenion thought, his chest tightening at the systemic failure of their sovereignty. If our riders leave for the south, we are entirely dependent on Theban goodwill to keep our western gates from collapsing. It is an absolute strategic trap. If we surrender the riders, we request that the Boeotian League explicitly map their patrol routes to secure our northern trade passes. We do not barter our men away for nothing. Pelopidas offered Parmenion a slow, calculating look of authentic professional recognition. The veteran knows the math, the Theban reasoned internally. He knows I am pulling the teeth from his jaws. Before Pelopidas could reply, young Attalus let loose a sharp, cynical bark of laughter that split the room's tension like a blade. His knuckles generated a fierce, metallic rattle against his bronze scabbard as his unadulterated Highlander pride flared into open defiance. Let them go, Parmenion, Attalus spat, his eyes wide, gleaming with an egoistic, predatory light as he looked from the terrified regent to the silent 14-year-old Philip in the shadows. Let the old men and the half-blood children trade their souls away. Attalus's inner monologue hissed with venomous clarity. The Queen Mother drops her last pawn directly into the mud of the south, and the regent kneels for his life. The entire Argead line is hollowed out today. This is the hour my lineage has waited for. He focused his dismissive gaze on Pelopidas. If the great hegemon of the south requires a 14-year-old boy and a few hundred horses to feel secure against the ghosts of Sparta, we should indulge his vanity. True Macedonian steel doesn't leave with the baggage train. It stays right here in the blood of the high peaks. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic, impatient thump of a wooden staff against the floor. Old Attalus stepped into the light, his face a landscape of deep, weathered creases. He didn't look at the Theban, he looked at his kinsman, his gaze heavy with a lifetime of disappointment. Fool, the elder thought, his chest tightening with a mix of fury and exhaustion. He thinks he is seizing a throne, but he is only picking the bones of a carcass already devoured by wolves. If he brings the pride of the peaks to the surface now, he will only invite the Thebans to cut us down before we have even begun to rebuild. Quiet, boy, old Attalus rasped, his voice cutting through the young man's bravado with the weight of absolute authority. He shifted his gaze toward Pelopidas, his eyes narrowing into slits. Vanity is a luxury for those who have a roof over their heads, hegemon. My kinsman speaks with the fire of youth, but he forgets that fire burns the hand that holds it. He leaned forward, his gnarled hand trembling slightly on his staff, not from weakness, but from the suppressed rage of a man watching his country commit suicide. You ask for our blood and our future to secure your flanks, Pelopidas. But look toward the north. While you demand our loyalty, the smoke from our burning outposts is already drifting through the valleys. When the wolf comes knocking at the gates of Pella, will your tactical auxiliary be enough to hold the line? Or are you simply clearing the path for the Illyrians to finish what you have started? Parmenion cast a lethal warning glare at the volatile younger general. The idiot's pride will get us all slaughtered before nightfall, Parmenion thought, his hand subtly shifting closer to his own weapon to suppress any sudden, premature eruption from the hot-headed youth. Ptolemy's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening against his bronze sword pommel as he realized the trap had fully closed around his throat. Young Attalus' treasonous arrogance and Eurydice's silent, lethal gaze forced him to swallow the poison. To refuse the treaty now meant facing both the immediate kinetic wrath of the Theban spears outside and her hidden knives within the palace walls. He turned back to the giant Theban, forcing his heavy, sweating features into a rigid, artificial smile. Your terms, General, manifest an exceptional, crystalline clarity. Ptolemy smoothed, the words scraping painfully against his throat like gravel. My administration shall withdraw to the inner palace to systematically audit the execution of this logistical blueprint alongside the frontier barons. From the deep shadows near the rear pillar, Philip stood perfectly still. His young, slight frame was enveloped in a dark wool cloak, but his gray eyes, so like his mother's, were wide and hyper-focused. He had watched the trembling of his brother, the desperation of Ptolemy, the cautious calculated move of Parmenion, the blind, explosive vanity of young Attalus, and the jagged, weary defiance of old Attalus as he stood against the Theban tide. Near him, Eurydice shifted, her presence as quiet as a held breath. She stood half-hidden by a heavy tapestry, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric. When their eyes met, Philip saw the tremor in her hands, a stark contrast to his own icy stillness. They are tearing the world apart, and they do not even notice us, Eurydice thought, a sharp, suffocating fear constricting her chest. Ptolemy is a broken reed, young Attalus is a torch that will burn us all, and Pelopidas, he is the shadow that intends to swallow everything. Philip looks so small, yet his eyes hold something that terrifies me more than the Illyrians. They speak of me as if I am cargo, Philip murmured, his voice barely audible, carrying a cold, terrifying serenity. A piece to be moved across a map, discarded, or traded. Eurydice stepped closer, her voice a desperate, ragged whisper. They don't see you, Philip. They look at you and see a pawn or a threat to be shackled. If you go to Thebes, you lose the only soil that knows your name. Stay here. We can find another way stay? Philip cut her off, his eyes fixed on the center of the hall, where Pelopidas stood waiting like a predator. And watch them burn this house to the ash while they bicker over the rubble. Ptolemy thinks I'm a harmless hostage, a trinket to be traded. Mother wants me gone so I can learn the tools to finish what they've started. Let them believe they are the ones shaping my fate. Eurydice fell silent, a cold, hollow dread settling into her marrow. She realized with terrifying clarity that he was already gone. The boy who once looked for guidance in her eyes had been replaced by something far more formidable. He wasn't afraid of the chains because he wasn't looking at them as a prison. He was already measuring the weight and reach of them, calculating exactly how to turn those same shackles into his own weapon. I will go to Thebes, Philip whispered, his tone devoid of doubt. I will watch their sacred band. I will master their deep phalanx, and I will become the very nightmare they think they are creating. By the time I return, this throne will be the only thing left of them." Eurydice looked at the boy, then at the chaos of the court. She reached out, her fingers brushing his sleeve, but he was already standing elsewhere, his mind light years removed from the stifling, smoke-filled room. "He will come back," she thought, a sudden, mournful clarity washing over her. "But the boy I knew will stay in the soil of Thebes, and a king will walk out of the ruins." Pelopidas offered a solitary, arrogant tilt of his chin, his vision sliding completely away from the withered regent to lock squarely onto the queen mother, acknowledging her as the authentic architect of the deal. He then caught the unblinking, precocious gaze of the 14-year-old prince in the shadows. A chilling realization rippled through the general's mind. This child wasn't cowering. He was studying the room like an architect, mapping an upcoming demolition. Eurydice felt the weight of that silent exchange like a physical blow to her chest. She stood tall, her posture a rigid armor of royal composure. But behind her eyes, her mind was a tempest of agonizing calculation. "He sees him," she thought, her pulse hammering against her ribs. "The Theban is sharp enough to recognize the predator beneath the skin, and yet he still reaches for the leash." She looked at Philip, her son, her project, her desperate gamble, and felt a pang of maternal grief so sharp it almost broke her stance. She knew that to save the crown, she had to cast him into the fire of the Theban military machine. "I am sending my own heart into the lion's den," she told herself, the thought laced with cold, iron-willed resolve. Let them underestimate him. Let them think he's merely a hostage to be held or a prince to be polished. They will teach him the geometry of war, and when he returns, he will not just reclaim this throne, he will tear down every wall that dared to lock him out. She tightened her grip on the throne's armrest, her knuckles turning bone white. "Forgive me, my son. I am forging you into the sword that will end us all." "Naturally, Regent," Pelopidas rasped, his lips twisting into the grim, predatory smile of a wolf settling accounts. "For the authentic purchase price of peace is rarely settled in gold bullion. It is computed exclusively by the total demolition and re-engineering of a kingdom's future. See to the boy's baggage train. We march at dawn." The stifling air in the house of pleasure was a world away from the cool, rugged mountain air of the Macedonian north. Here, in the sprawling, sun-drenched chaos of Athens, the atmosphere was heavy with the cloying scent of cheap incense, stale wine, and the underlying metallic tang of unwashed bodies. Lysandra adjusted her shawl, her nose twitching at the familiar, rancid perfume that tried and failed to mask the harsh reality of the trade. She was led through a labyrinth of low-ceilinged rooms by a man who moved with the predatory, oiled confidence of a pornibus. He was a man of thick neck and thicker rings, his presence in the room commanding a space that felt both crowded and empty. "They are being difficult," the pimp grunted, his thumb hooked into his belt. "I have clients arriving by dusk. If they are not fit for the couch, I lose coin. Fix them, healer." Quickly, Lysandra didn't spare him a glance, her gaze fixed on the two women huddled on a worn pallet in the corner. Phryne looked up, her face a pale mask of fatigue, while young Ilara sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes wide with a frantic, animal terror. The pimp loomed over them, his shadow stretching across the floor like a stain. "Well, I pay for results, not for them to look at the walls." "Leave us," Lysandra said, her voice cutting through the humid air with the cold, absolute authority of a surgeon. She turned to look the pimp in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "If you stay, I cannot inspect the inflammation. Do you want them working, or do you want them rotting? Go." The pimp sneered, his lip curling, but he sensed the iron in her spine. With a final, sharp glare at the women, he turned on his heel, his heavy sandals slapping against the stone floor as he exited, his voice booming as he yelled for a slave in the hallway. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room plummeted. Ilara let out a shaky, jagged breath, and Phryne leaned back against the wall, the mask of the hardened entertainer sliding away to reveal the raw, trembling exhaustion underneath. "He thinks we are made of bronze," Phryne whispered, her voice brittle. "He doesn't understand that the more he pushes comma, the faster the metal fatigues." Lysandra didn't waste time. She knelt beside them, pulling a small linen bag of medicinals from her kit. "Show me, Ilara. The morning sickness?" Ilara nodded, her hands shaking as she pulled her tunic up to reveal the slight, precarious rounding of her stomach. "If he finds out, he will cast me out," she sobbed, the sound muffled by her hands. "He will say I have cheated him of my time." Lysandra's hands were steady as she placed a cool, damp compress of mint-infused cloth over the girl's abdomen. "He won't know," she murmured, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "We will manage this. But you must eat the broth I bring. No matter what he says, you drink it." She then turned to Phryne, who pulled the hem of her saffron dress to reveal the angry crimson-raw skin of her inner thighs. The sight was a map of the city's indifference, the inflammation of constant forced use. Lysandra opened her jar of mallow and streaked John's wort, the pale green paste cool against the heat of the infection. "The trade is a cycle, Phryne," Lysandra said, her movements precise and rhythmic as she applied the salve. "The men take, the master takes, and the city takes its tax. But you must learn to guard the gate." Phryne gripped Lysandra's wrist, her fingers bruisingly tight. "And what happens when the gate breaks, Lysandra? What happens when there is nothing left to take?" Lysandra looked at her, her expression unyielding, her eyes reflecting the dim, flickering light of the oil lamp. "Then you survive however you can. In a city that treats us as currency, the only true act of rebellion is to remain whole." Outside the room, the pimp's voice rose in a shout, the sound of a closing deal echoing through the house. A reminder that in Athens, the lives of these women were merely a footnote to the business of the state. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic application of the salve. Lysandra did not look at Phryne or Ilara with pity. Pity was for those who believed the situation was an accident of fate, a tragedy that could have been avoided. To Lysandra, this room was simply the honest expression of the city's bones. She did not view these women as lesser because they sold their bodies, nor did she view the wives in the wealthy houses as higher because they sold their silence. To her, every woman in Athens was a captive in a system designed to keep the world under the thumb of those who feared the source of their own existence. Whether it was the noblewoman in the secluded gymnasium or the hetaira on the public couch, the architecture of their confinement was identical. "We are all livestock," she thought, her fingers working the cooling ointment into Phryne's inflamed skin. "Some of us are kept in the pasture for the harvest, and some of us are kept in the stable for the labor. But the fence belongs to the men, and the gate is locked from the outside." Men had built an entire theology and legal code around their own supremacy, a frantic, desperate structure meant to convince themselves that they were the masters of creation. It was a projection of their own deep-seated insecurity. They were terrified of the very power that birthed them. Even Zeus, the king of their pantheon, had only survived because his mother, Rhea, had deceived his father, tricking him into swallowing a stone so that the true heir might live to overthrow the old order. Men consumed their own, feared their own children, and spent every waking moment trying to domesticate the power that held the secret to life itself. "You look at me as if I'm broken," Phryne murmured, catching Lysandra's steady gaze. "I look at you as a woman doing what is required to endure," Lysandra replied, her voice devoid of sympathy, carrying instead a hard, resonant truth. "There is no difference between you and the wife of an archon, Phryne. She's fed, clothed, and secured by a man, kept behind walls to ensure his legacy is pure. She's a vessel for his name. You are a vessel for his lust. Both of you are ruled, both of you are used, and both of you are forbidden from owning the breath in your own lungs." Ilara wiped her eyes, her trembling subsiding as the reality of Lysandra's words took root. "The men think they are supreme," Lysandra continued, her eyes dark with a cynical, ancient wisdom. "They write their laws, they build their temples, and they debate their logic as if they are the architects of the universe. But they know deep in the marrow of their bones that they are terrified. They are afraid of what a woman is capable of when she stops trying to earn their approval. They hate us because we are the origin of everything they claim to possess." She capped the jar with a sharp clack, the sound echoing in the small room. "Don't cry because you are a sex worker, Ilara. Don't weep because you are trapped. If you must weep, weep, because they have convinced us that there is a difference between the woman in the palace and the woman in the brothel. There isn't. We are all just waiting for the day we stop feeding the monster that tries to swallow us whole." Lysandra stood up, her posture tall and unyielding. The pimp was pacing outside, his heavy footsteps impatient, a man desperate to reclaim his investment. But inside the room, for this one brief moment, the air didn't smell of fear. It smelled of a cold, hard, and dangerous clarity. Lysandra packed her tools with rhythmic efficiency, the metal clinking softly against the glass jars. The heavy, suffocating weight of the previous conversation lingered, but she needed to shift the frequency. She needed information, the kind of currency that didn't circulate in the marketplace or the assembly. Enough of the tragedy, Lysandra said, her voice dry, pulling a small, corked vial from her kit and setting it on the pallet. Tell me something else. I've been buried in roots and remedies all week. What are the men whispering about when they think you aren't listening? Ilara blinked, her eyes still red-rimmed, though a flicker of simple-minded distraction replaced the terror. Whispering? They mostly complain about the price of wine, or the way the ships in the harbor are held up, she said, her voice airy and unburdened by anything resembling depth. Old Lysimachus tried to recite poetry again, but he kept forgetting the lines. He just sat there and cried until he fell asleep. Phryne chuckled, a hollow, sharp sound. And the one from the northern islands, the merchant? He brought his own silk sheets and asked me to pretend I was a statue. He sat in the corner for an hour just staring at me. Said it made him feel ordered. Lysandra hid her smile. These girls played the part of the vacant vessels perfectly. And in doing so, they moved through the city's elite like ghosts through walls. They were the receptacles of every secret, every shame, and every twisted impulse that the supreme Athenian male spent his daylight hours repressing. They think these girls are simple, Lysandra mused, watching them pick at their frayed hemlines. They think because the girls offer their bodies, they surrender their eyes. These men come here to escape the cage of their own public image, never realizing that the women they use to loosen their psyches are the very ones who hold the keys to their private ruin. It was the ultimate divine comedy. The Athenian man, the master of the oikos, the speaker in the assembly, the arbiter of logic and law, walked through these doors and dissolved. Some wanted to be punished, begging to be whipped as if seeking the lash of a mother they feared to displease. Others wanted to be infants, craving a softness they were taught to despise as weakness. They arrived armored in ego, yet they stripped themselves bare of their control the moment they breathed the scent of perfume and roses. They are all terrified of the chaos inside them, she thought, closing her bag. They spend their lives building systems to conquer it, but here, in the dark, they abandon the architecture and crawl into the abyss. They seek the very thing they claim to be superior to, desperate to be mastered by the soft skin they treat as nothing more than a commodity. And the Archon's nephew? Lysandra asked, her voice low, probing. He visited the district 2 nights ago, did he not? I heard he was looking for something specific. Phryne's eyes sharpened for a fraction of a second, the vacant look vanishing. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a state secret. He didn't want the usual. He wanted to be tied. He wanted to be told what to do, and he cried like a boy when I refused to let him leave. He offered me a ring, gold, heavy with the family crest, if I would just hold him until the sun came up. Lysandra stood, the bag of secrets heavy in her hand. The duality was staggering. A man who could order the life of a slave, yet who stood in a darkened room, weeping for a stranger to tell him he was safe. They remain hidden in the abyss, Lysandra thought, walking toward the door. They believe they have domesticated the world, but they are all just drowning in the fear of their own appetites. And the best part, they have no idea that I know exactly how hollow their supremacy truly is. Lysandra stood by the heavy curtain of the room, her hand resting on the fabric as she looked back at the two women. The air in the house was still stale, but the mood had shifted. They were no longer just patient and healer, but conspirators in the dark. Tell me, Lysandra asked, her voice low and edged with a sharp curiosity. The Dionysian festivals are approaching. You all know the rites, the madness, the spilling of wine. How do the men see it? When they talk of the Maenads and the women tearing into the wild, how does it sit with them? Phryne let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering over stone. They speak of it with a mix of terror and hunger, Lysandra. They call it sacred in the temples, but in the dark they call it a rot. They fear the wine and they fear the women who drink it. Ilara nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. The master talks about it constantly. He says the women lose their minds, that they abandon their duties and their husbands to wander the mountains. He says it's a corruption, that the madness should be illegal, or at least heavily policed. But then, he goes to the tavern, drinks until he can barely stand, and spends half the night raving about how he wishes he could see them, he wishes he could see the women unleashed. Lysandra watched them closely, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions. It was a classic Athenian contradiction. The men built a rigid, logical society that required women to be silent, predictable, and confined, yet their own religion centered on a god of chaos and divine intoxication. So they fear the loss of control, Lysandra mused, a cold smile touching her lips. They worship a god of madness, yet they demand total sobriety from the world they control. They want the wine, but they want to own the cup. Exactly, Phryne said, leaning forward. They are obsessed with the idea of the Maenads. They whisper about it as if it's the ultimate taboo. They believe that if a woman is left to her own nature, she will inevitably descend into a murderous, wild, and uncontrollable state. It validates everything they say about us, that we are by nature unstable, dangerous, and in need of their protection to keep us from tearing the world apart. And yet, Alara added, her voice dropping to a whisper, the same men who complain about the danger of the rites are the ones who pay the most for wine and seek out women who promise them a taste of that same wildness. They want to be frightened, Lysandra. They want to be led into the abyss by someone who isn't afraid to walk there. Lysandra felt the familiar, bitter amusement rising in her chest. The Dionysian festival was the only time the Athenian patriarchy allowed the illusion of chaos, a safety valve for the pressures they themselves created. They allowed the women to go mad for a night, only to drag them back into the cage the next morning, satisfied that they had successfully contained the very forces they were most afraid of. The power of women to exist outside of their design. It is a masquerade, Lysandra concluded, her voice cold and resonant. They let the women dance in the hills so they can pretend they are the masters of the chaos. They are terrified of the truth, that the madness isn't a corruption, it's just a version of us they can't own. And that, more than anything else, is what they can never forgive. She looked at the two women, seeing the flickers of defiance beneath their exhaustion. The next time your master speaks of the festival, watch his eyes. He isn't worried about the social order. He's worried that in the hills, for one night, the women aren't looking at him at all. To be continued in episode 42, Collision of Bronze and Steel. A Great Argead Saga Alexine. Volume 1, Telesius, the War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesius playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.